This video is going to talk about the first four books of the New Testament, and for this course we're going to call all four of them, in order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Synoptic Gospels. In other words, those people who saw Jesus with their eyes, synoptic, and wrote about him. Sometimes these four Synoptic Gospel writers are also known as evangelists. And I want to talk about that word because it also gives us an insight to the genre. Evangelist is a word borrowed from the Roman government. When the Roman army under its Caesar would go out for battle and would claim, say, a new country for their own and were victorious, they would retreat back to the capital city. And when they retreated, there was a foot soldier who went ahead of the victorious army and would go through the villages and shout out, "The Caesar's coming. Our army is going to come through. Come out, see the way. Our kingdom is bigger. Your life is going to get better. Things have changed. Come, let's have a parade." That foot soldier who came ahead of the army and told the good news was called an evangelon. In the same way, the Bible then will borrow that word. Here comes four writers who will tell you, come out, the Messiah has come. Your world is better. Your world has changed. We are all richer for it. This is a time of joy. That's where we get our word evangelist. And they're all going to come on the scene to tell us about Jesus, a name that is simply Greek of the Hebrew name Joshua. Joshua and Jesus both are names, Hebrew and Greek respectively, that translate God saves. Jesus is the Messiah that the Old Testament has been waiting for, is what each of our four evangelists will say. The thesis, the problem, the antithesis, if you will, is that this is the Messiah, they'll all say, but what we need you to understand, people, is that it's not the kind of Messiah that you might have been expecting. In the Old Testament, they might have been envisioning sort of a military Messiah, a political hero. And what our evangelists will tell us is that, surprise, yes, God has sent his Messiah, but his kingdom is way bigger than any one country or one politician. He will come to bring a spiritual kingdom, a world without end. That's the problem with the current Jewish religious establishment and the evangelists. The current Jewish establishment of the New Testament keeps saying, but this can't be the Messiah. He's breaking rules. He says he's a rabbi, but he doesn't do this or that or this. This is what we've led to believe. And then the evangelists or the synoptics always telling us, yes, but you're thinking too small. The first evangelist or synoptic writer then is Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector before he turned to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Matthew was also a Jewish person who converted. In other words, he believed that Jesus did come walking off the pages of the Old Testament as the Messiah. Matthew was not only a synoptic writer, but he was also a disciple of Jesus, one of those 12. Disciple is a Greek word that literally means a learner. He followed Jesus around. Jesus the rabbi, another good word, by the way. Rabbi simply means teacher. In those days, it was very common that rabbis, teachers, would live and move with their students, their learners, so that the students would have 24/7 access to their teacher. Jesus and his disciples were not unique in that regard. At any rate, Matthew is a writer and a learner, a disciple, and he's a Jew who became a Christ follower. Therefore, his book naturally tends to focus on getting other Jews, like he was, to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. To do that, he loves to reference and shadow the Old Testament, if you will. That's why Matthew begins with the genealogy from Adam all the way to Jesus, to show a Jew, look, here comes Jesus, right off the pages as was predicted. Matthew, for example, will have the story of the Nativity and tell us a story right away about Jesus' dad, a man named Joseph. Joseph had a dream, and so he fled to Egypt for safety. Doesn't that sound familiar to an Old Testament scholar like a Jew would be? Think back to our stories of Genesis. We were also told a story of Joseph, a dreamer who ended up in Egypt. The Old Testament would tell a story about God speaking to his people from a mountain with 10 words. Matthew, chapters 5 and 6, will talk about Jesus, God, speaking from a mountain, the Sermon on the Mount, with 10 words, but here 10 Beatitudes, 10 blessings. These constant Old Testament allusions is Matthew's sort of perspective, the palette of color that he will use as he tells the story. Mark, the next gospel writer. Mark was a fisherman. He was not a disciple, so he wrote a book, but he was busy fishing. He didn't follow Jesus around as one of his learners. Sometimes he'll be referred to as John Mark. Because Mark is a fisherman, his writing is very, very simple. It's the shortest gospel. We also think it was the first. And here's the other thing. In every English Bible that you see, if you go to the Gospel of Mark and go to the end of the 15th chapter, you will see there in almost every English Bible a definitive line before the Gospel of Mark concludes. And that's because the ending of Mark is not original. In the original that we have, Mark ends his short gospel with the Easter story, and that the women went to the tomb and they saw the grave was empty and they were afraid. The last word originally was the word afraid. A couple of hundred years later, some Christians said, he must not have. Nobody ends a book with the word afraid. Maybe the last page of the scroll got ripped off. Maybe we lost it. Maybe he ran out of ink. We need to finish it as we think it should have been finished. And they did. That's the end of Mark chapter 16. It's been accepted. It's canonical. Council of Carthage picked it up, but just know that it's not original, and nobody denies that it isn't. That's Mark. Very simple, very straightforward, and he loves to move things along. One of his favorite words is, and immediately. You read through Mark at breakneck speed. Luke, the third synoptic writer. Luke was a physician, a doctor, which makes sense that he includes every last healing miracle. As a doctor, this fascinated him. Jesus, the healer. And by the way, most often do we not even get the healing, but we get the prescription, the diagnosis, what Jesus did, the results. It's just a wonderful first century, almost doctor's report that you're reading. Luke, the healer. And then finally, John. John is so different from the other first three synoptics that sometimes he's not called a synoptic. He's given his own genre. But for this course, we'll include him in the synoptics. John was an author and a learner, so he was a disciple, just like Matthew. Where Mark was super simple Greek, John is elegant, complicated, and complex in a most beautiful way. He's incredibly symbolic. For example, John has exactly 7, the perfect number of miracles. But he doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs. He has Jesus recorded as saying exact 7 perfect I am statements. I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the life, I'm the gate. Remember that 7 is not only perfect, but that I am statement, you see, recalls that verse that you read in Exodus 3 when Moses asked God the name in the bush, what's your name? And the bush said, I am. So when John has Jesus saying, I am, every Jew would have known that, you see, as Jesus calling himself God. There's another beautiful thing about John that I love, and that is he loves the metaphor of water. Water is kind of like a stream that flows through the book of John and holds it all together. We're told that Jesus' first sign was turning water into wine at Canaan. Then he meets a woman at a well. At the very end of the gospel, he's the only one that tells us that on Good Friday, when Jesus was stabbed in the side, that not only blood flowed out of his side, but also water. In all these ways, he loves to play, by the way, on the words dark and light, seeing and not seeing, clear and muddied. In all these layers, John is just wonderfully complex. Now, together, all 4 synoptics, again, what they're trying to tell us is that Jesus is the Messiah, but he may not be the kind of Messiah you would be expecting. For example, just one way we see this is already in the book of Luke, the one that gives us the most complete narrative of Jesus's birth and nativity, probably the one you most often hear every Christmas. Now, if you were a Jew waiting for a political Messiah, you would be waiting for a Messiah's birth, and you would think, well, he'd be born to aristocratic parents, probably a Caesar and the Queen. He'd be placed in royal silk baby clothes, put in a royal crib. The first visitors would be VIP, diplomats, ambassadors. He'd be born in Rome, right? So think about the nativity story of Jesus as told by Luke. Everything is exactly the opposite of what you would think. Not born to aristocrats, but to a carpenter and an unwed, pregnant teenage mom. Not a palace, but a cave, a barn, they call it. A cave is just a niche in a hillside where you'd put your animals for the night and build a fire in the front so they won't get out. Not in Jerusalem, but Bethlehem, small little hamlet of a town. Not put in royal purple robes, but wrapped in swaddling cloths, literally rags. Not put in a crib, but put in a manger. That just means a feeding trough. First visitors were not VIP ambassadors and dignitaries, but shepherds. And remember that in first century Palestine, shepherds were unclean people. They lived with animals, they smelled, they were always stealing from you because they were always bringing their flocks onto your land to eat your grass and drink your water. I don't mean any disrespect here, but the first century people of Palestine thought of shepherds as maybe we think of gypsies. And those were Jesus's first visitors. Why all of this? You see, to make the case again that yes, Jesus is the Messiah, but he's not the kind of political Messiah you are expecting and looking for. How will they go on to make this case? They then will show we'll hear a lot about his birth, then we hear virtually nothing about him for the next 20, 30 years, until the last 3 years of his life, which is called the public ministry. Then we'll hear about Jesus through miraculous miracles. Those miracles include the healing of humans. Perhaps the most famous is the raising of Lazarus. We'll hear about miracles over nature. The most common one there is the calming of the Sea of Galilee. Each of the 4 gospel writers tell us about that. Jesus will reveal himself as Messiah through teaching, mainly through parables. We have over 40 of them. Parables are what I call earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And because many times Jesus was talking to farmers, you see, he would tell a story that they could relate to and then apply it. So, for example, a farmer went out to sow his seed and all the seed grew up. You see, and he'd say, well, that's like the kingdom of God. I'm here telling the word of God and it's going to grow up in you. An earthly story with a heavenly meaning. There's over 40 parables about that. Jesus will also teach through direct preaching. We have a complete transcript of a sermon in Matthew 5 and 6, the Sermon on the Mount. And then Jesus will teach through example. He doesn't just talk about doing right. He doesn't just talk about befriending people. No, he sits down with the marginalized. He has dinner with tax collectors, widows, leprous people. He welcomes children, a compassionate response. All of this is not only a witness to people who are believing a Messiah will come, but just not expecting this kind of Messiah, but it's also a teaching all these ways to a group of people called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the religious leaders. Think of them, as you will, in the Christian context, the equivalent to pastors or priests or professors of religion. They knew the law, the Old Testament. And in the Jewish way of thinking at that time, there were 614 Old Testament laws. And Jesus comes on the scene, he pretty much ignores all of them. He'll heal on a Sunday. Like I said, he'll be talking to women at a well. And this, you see, this is what riles up the religious establishment. They say he's his own worst witness. He's proving to us that he can't be a Jew. Therefore, he can't be the Messiah because he's not keeping any of these laws. He's changing it all up. That also will be the antithesis. And we'll see more about that. It will come to a head on Holy Week when the religious people finally say, we've had enough. We've got to get rid of him. He's a fraud. He's spreading heresy among us. And the Old Testament says, those who commit blasphemy, we've got to do away with. So that's where this is going. The next lecture then will talk about Jesus in specificity. And somehow I have to take the main figure of Christianity and reduce a talk in about 20 minutes. So what I've decided to do, maybe the best way to do that, is just to review the last week of Jesus's life. Because not only is that what we have the most material on in the Synoptic Gospels, but also each day of the week reveals something kind of else about his person and mission and his theology that we can see. So it'll be kind of a double entendre walk through the last week of Jesus's life. And I think that would be the best way to introduce Jesus as the central figure of the Gospels and of the Christian faith. We'll see you then for that talk.